Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into it with the U.S.-China trade relationship. Well, it's complicated, isn't it?
It certainly is. Lots of moving parts, and we've gathered quite a bit of material to try and make sense of where things stand.
Yeah, we've got recent articles, some pretty detailed economic analyses, stuff from think tanks, even looked at what people are saying online, like on Reddit.
That's right. We're pulling from places like BBVA Research, Wikipedia's detailed trade war page, which is surprisingly useful for timelines, Brookings, CEPII for economic modeling.
And that Reddit thread, which gives a different kind of pulse.
Exactly. A mix of formal analysis and more public discourse.
So our mission, really, for you listening, is to cut through all the jargon, the political noise, and just lay out the key facts. What's happening, what might happen, different perspectives.
And hopefully equip you with the essentials without making your head spin.
Yeah.
It's a big topic.
It really is. Okay, so let's start with the here and now. Where are things, it sounds like?
Yeah, well, not much is happening in terms of talks. That seems to be the message coming from China, certainly. They've stated pretty clearly there are no ongoing trade talks with the U.S. right now.
And they're pushing for the U.S. to cancel tariffs.
Yes, calling them unilateral tariffs and wanting them gone. We saw that mentioned in some reports and echoed in those Reddit discussions, too.
Unilateral, meaning imposed by the U.S. without, like, a mutual agreement.
Precisely. Imposed by one side. And this whole situation, it feels quite different from back in 2018 when this round of tariffs first started heating up.
Oh, so what's changed?
Well, a big factor is China's domestic situation. BBVA Research points this out quite strongly. Back in 2018, their economy looked different now. They're dealing with some serious challenges.
Like the housing market issues we hear about.
Exactly. A major collapse in the housing sector, which hits household wealth hard. Plus, local governments are apparently struggling financially because they're not making as much money from land sales anymore.
Okay, so internal pressures are probably shaping their external stance and negotiating position, maybe.
Yeah. It seems very likely, yes. Their calculus has shifted.
Meanwhile, the U.S. hasn't exactly been standing still on the tariff front either, right? There have been recent increases.
That's correct. If you look at the timeline, say, on Wikipedia, it notes that in 2024, the U.S. increased tariffs on quite a few Chinese goods.
What kind of goods are we talking about?
Things like solar cells, EV batteries, the stuff for electric cars, steel, aluminum, a fairly broad list.
And those are kicking in soon.
They're set to take full effect in September 2024, so quite soon, really.
And is that likely the end of it, or is there talk of more?
Well, there's definitely anticipation of more. That BBVA research analysis we mentioned, it actually floated a scenario, quite a stark one, of a potential 60% tariff on all imports from China.
60% on everything?
Yeah, possibly by mid-2025. That's
Yeah.
one projection they explored.
Wow, that would be huge. What do the economic models say about something like that if tariffs went that high?
Well, this is where organizations like CEPI come in. They run these complex models, trying to predict the fallout.
And what's the prediction?
They suggest that tariffs at that level, especially if China hits back with its own, which is likely could cause a significant drop, not just in U.S.-China trade, but potentially global trade and GDP for both the U.S. and China.
A drop in GDP. How much are we talking?
In one of their main scenarios with those kinds of reciprocal tariffs, they projected GDP losses of around 1.3% for both the U.S. and China.
Okay, 1.3%. That doesn't sound catastrophic maybe, but it's definitely not small either. It's a real economic hit.
It's a noticeable impact for sure. And remember, these models are based on assumptions, but they give us a sense of the scale.
And what about for, regular people? For consumers here in the U.S., does this mean things get more expensive?
That's the general expectation, yes. Both Brookings and CEPII analyses point towards higher prices for U.S. consumers.
And we've seen that before, haven't we, with the earlier tariffs?
Exactly. Studies looking back at the 2018-19 tariffs mentioned on Wikipedia and by Brookings found that the cost was largely passed on to U.S. importers and ultimately U.S. customers.
So the idea that the exporting country pays the tariff doesn't really hold up in practice. It's usually the importer or the end consumer who pays more.
That's what the evidence tends to show, yes.
And what about businesses? Besides potentially higher costs, what else do they face?
Well, Brookings highlighted this. It creates a lot of near-term chaos, really. Businesses have to suddenly renegotiate contracts, maybe scramble to find new suppliers, reconfigure their whole supply chain. It's disruptive.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, so that's the potential impact.
Yeah.
How might China actually respond to all this beyond just saying no talks?
Well, one angle that came up in those Reddit discussions was interesting, this idea of national sentiment, patriotism.
How does that play in?
The suggestion was that many people in China might be willing to sort of tighten their belts, endure some economic pain, if they see the U.S. as being the main cause of the trade friction.
Ah, so public opinion could give the government more room to maneuver, maybe resist pressure.
It could be a factor, yeah.
Yeah.
A sense of rallying around the flag, so to speak.
Are there more concrete economic levers they could pull?
Definitely. That same Reddit thread mentioned the possibility of China using government stimulus spending programs to boost their own internal consumption, trying to make up for lost U.S. demand by getting their own population to buy more.
Okay, stimulate domestically. What about internationally?
Strengthening partnerships elsewhere is key. Looking towards Southeast Asia, ASEAN countries, and trying to improve relations with the EU. Wikipedia actually notes that the previous trade tensions did lead to stronger China-EU economic ties.
So diversifying their customer base, essentially.
Right. And of course, there's the possibility of direct retaliation, hitting back with their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Which they've done before.
They have, and as those CEPII models suggest, that would likely just increase the economic pain for the U.S. side as well. Becomes a negative-sum game fairly quickly.
Tit-for-tat tariffs hurting both sides. Has they used other tools? I seem to remember something about minerals.
Yes, critical minerals. BBVA research mentioned China has used export controls on these in the past, materials needed for things like electronics.
Were those controls effective?
Their effectiveness has been debated, actually. BBVA noted that U.S. reliance on China for some critical minerals hasn't fundamentally changed all that much despite those controls. So maybe not as powerful a tool as initially thought.
Interesting. And one more point from that Reddit thread, the idea that China might demand the U.S. roll back existing restrictions first before any de-escalation happens.
Yeah, that reflects a sort of hardline perspective that China might feel it's in a position to demand concessions from the U.S., like removing existing tech restrictions, as a precondition for talks. It highlights how complex the negotiations could be if they happen.
Right. Let's shift focus a bit to the U.S. side. What were the original goals when the U.S. started imposing these tariffs back in 2018?
According to the background info, like on Wikipedia, the stated aims were things like reducing the trade deficit with China, trying to encourage manufacturing jobs to come back to the U.S.
Reshoring, yeah.
Exactly. And also tackling issues like intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer.
Okay, those were the goals. How's it worked out? Have the tariffs achieved those things?
Well, on the first couple of goals, reducing the deficit and bringing back lots of manufacturing jobs, most economists are pretty skeptical. Wikipedia sums up that consensus fairly well. Tariffs generally aren't seen as the most effective way to do that.
But I remember seeing a point on Reddit that framed it differently, not just about jobs, but about, like, national sovereignty.
Yes, that's a different argument. The idea that even if it doesn't bring back masses of middle-class jobs, having certain manufacturing capabilities domestically is important for national security, for resilience, for not being overly reliant on, well, potentially adversarial countries for critical goods.
So a strategic argument rather than a purely economic one.
Exactly. It shifts the rationale somewhat.
And it sounds like within the U.S., there isn't really universal agreement on whether this whole trade war strategy is working or what its effects are.
Oh, definitely not. There are lots of different views. Wikipedia mentions, for instance, the impact on agriculture. U.S. farmers faced retaliatory tariffs from China, which hit them hard. So different sectors experienced the effects very differently.
And it wasn't just tariffs the U.S. used, was it? There was also the tech angle.
That's become a huge part of it, yes. The U.S. has put significant restrictions on China's access to advanced technology, particularly semiconductors, the really high-end chips, and the equipment needed to make them.
Justified on national security grounds, usually.
That's the primary justification given, yes. And China, as noted on Wikipedia and elsewhere, has responded with its own moves, like threatening export controls on materials needed for chip production, like gallium and germanium.
So it's really broadened beyond just trade in goods to this technology competition, almost a tech war footing.
You could definitely describe it that way. It's a multi-front competition.
Looking ahead then, what are the sort of longer-term ripples we might see from all this continued friction?
There are a few possibilities people are discussing. One slightly counterintuitive idea, again popping up in that Reddit discussion, was that this trade war could actually, in the long run, accelerate China's path to becoming the world's largest economy.
Really? How would that work? It seems like it would hurt their economy.
The thinking is that the pressure forces them to double down on self-reliance, innovate faster in key areas where they're being restricted, and build stronger economic blocs with other countries, ultimately reducing the relative dominance of the U.S. in the global system. It's a long-term argument, of course.
Interesting theory. What else?
Another point raised online was about the U.S.'s image as a trading partner. If policies seem unpredictable, tariffs go up and down.
Hmm.
Does that make other countries nervous?
Makes sense. They might start looking for more stable partners, maybe hedging their bets.
Exactly. It could potentially erode trust and lead other nations to pursue, alternative strategies, maybe regional trade blocs that rely less on the U.S. being predictable.
And what about the whole global system, the WTO, the rules of trade?
That's a major concern highlighted by CPII, this kind of ongoing tension, the use of tariffs that arguably fall outside the established WTO framework. It could seriously weaken the whole multilateral trading system, the rules-based order everyone talks about.
Undermining the very foundation of global trade as we've known it for decades.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
If major players increasingly sidestep the rules, it makes the system less effective for everyone.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up, bringing it all together from our deep dive today. It seems the U.S.-China trade relationship is basically gridlocked right now.
Yeah, kind of a standoff. Significant tariffs are already in place, and there's a very real possibility of more coming down the pike.
And the economic analysis we looked at suggests these tariffs, especially if met with retaliation, likely mean higher prices for consumers and a drag on economic growth for both countries.
That's the consensus from the models, though people debate the exact scale and the long-term effects, naturally.
And in response, it looks like China is focusing inwards, trying to boost its domestic economy, but also outwards, strengthening ties with other regions like ASEAN and the EU.
Yeah, a strategy of resilience and diversification, perhaps.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the U.S. focus seems to remain on addressing the trade imbalance in national security, using tariffs and these tech restrictions as key tools.
Right. Well, we hope that walking through all of this, the different analyses, the potential impacts, the various perspectives, has given you, our listeners, a clearer picture of this really complex situation.
It's definitely multifaceted, and maybe leaves us with a final thought, something for you to ponder.
Yeah.
Given these economic costs we've discussed, the potential damage to the global trading system, what are the realistic long-term scenarios if this level of tension just continues? What does the future of global trade look like? And maybe more fundamentally, who ultimately pays the price for these policies?
Good questions. Definitely something to keep thinking about as this all continues to play out.